The morning Juniper Ashby signed the marriage certificate, her mother was still in surgery on the second floor of Foothills Regional, and the hallway outside the waiting room smelled like burnt coffee and floor wax. She'd been awake for 31 hours. The man sitting across from her in the waiting room, Callum Reeve, 36, owner of Reeve Ranch outside of Pincher Creek, Alberta, had not spoken a word in the last 20 minutes. He sat with his hat on his knee, his hands resting loose and open, watching the window like the parking lot outside held something worth looking at. Juniper's father had borrowed $43,000 from Callum's uncle 18 months ago to keep the family's grain operation running through a bad harvest. Her father had died in February, before the debt was settled. The uncle, Boyd Reeve, had called her in March, the week she'd moved back from Edmonton to help her mother manage what was left. Boyd Reeve had not been unkind about it. He had also not been flexible. Callum had driven down from the ranch himself. He'd sat in their kitchen for 2 hours. He'd drunk 3 cups of her mother's weak tea and declined the biscuits she offered, and at the end of it he'd said, "The debt clears if you come out to the ranch and help manage the household for a season. Or you can marry me. Either way, the land stays in your family's name." Her mother had gone into cardiac arrest 2 days later. The first option had disappeared the moment the ambulance came. The justice of the peace was a small, tired woman named Mrs. Gowan, who'd driven 40 minutes from Lethbridge as a favor. The paperwork took 11 minutes. Juniper signed where she was told to sign. Callum signed where he was told to sign. Mrs. Gowan shook both their hands, said she hoped the mother pulled through, and left. Callum stood, put his hat back on, and said, "The drive is about an hour and a half, whenever you're ready." She wasn't ready. She went anyway. The ranch was nothing like what she'd imagined, which embarrassed her later when she thought about what she had imagined. Something dark, maybe. Something in disrepair. A man who'd needed to barter a wife because no woman would come willingly. What she found instead was 3,000 acres of rolling foothills, with the Rockies behind them like a wall of blue-gray light, a working cattle and quarter-horse operation, a house that was old but clean, and a man who left her door alone. He gave her the south-facing room at the end of the hall. There was a quilt on the bed and a hook behind the door for her coat, and a window that looked out over the corral. He did not explain the house to her. He did not hover. He went back to work. For the first 3 days, Juniper moved through the rooms like she was house-sitting for someone she'd never met. She made herself tea. She sat at the kitchen table with her phone and called the hospital in Pincher Creek every 4 hours to check on her mother's recovery. She watched the ranch hands come and go from the yard. She did not know what was expected of her. She was afraid to ask. On the 4th morning, she came downstairs at 6 and found that someone had already made coffee. Callum was at the table, reading something on his phone. He didn't look up when she came in. "There's a list on the counter," he said, "if you want it. Nothing urgent." The list was handwritten on the back of a feed invoice. "Pantry needs stocking, farrier comes Thursday." "Payroll Friday, binders in the office, top shelf," that was it. No instructions, no tone. She stocked the pantry. She was there when the farrier came. She found the payroll binders. She was not sure, in those first weeks, whether she was angry or simply numb. She moved through the tasks because the tasks were there, and because doing nothing felt worse. Her mother was recovering slowly. Juniper drove down to Pincher Creek on Tuesdays and Thursdays to sit with her for a few hours. Callum never commented on the time she took. He never asked her to account for her whereabouts. That, more than anything, confused her. She had come prepared to be managed. Men who held debt over women's heads usually wanted something clear in return: obedience, performance, the appearance of gratitude. Callum seemed to want nothing except for the household to function and the coffee to be ready before 6. She watched him carefully, the way you watch something you don't yet understand. He was not a gentleman in any soft sense of the word. He was direct to the point of bluntness, slow to laugh, and entirely uninterested in small talk. When one of the horses went lame in early June, he spent 2 nights sleeping in the barn and said nothing about it at breakfast. When a ranch hand named Vic Drummond made a comment at the supper table that Juniper found condescending, Callum looked at him once and said, "That's enough," and that was the end of it. He never explained himself. He never needed to. She began to understand slowly that the silences were not hostile. They were just how he was. There was an evening in late June when she'd been out on the porch, trying to get a cell signal to call her friend Rosamund back in Edmonton, and she'd given up, and just sat there in the last of the light. Callum came out after a while with 2 mugs of tea. He made it stronger than her mother, not as strong as she liked, but close enough, and set one on the railing beside her without saying anything. Then he sat down in the other chair and watched the mountains go dark. They didn't speak for an hour. She drove back to Pincher Creek the next morning and found her mother sitting up in the hospital bed, looking better than she had since February. Her mother took one look at Juniper's face and said, "He's not what you expected." It wasn't a question. "No," Juniper said. Her mother was quiet for a moment, then, "Is that good or bad?" Juniper didn't have an answer yet. What she hadn't been told, what no one had thought to mention, or perhaps what everyone had assumed she already knew, was that Reeve Ranch was in the middle of a legal dispute. She found out by accident. She'd gone into Callum's office to check on a supplier invoice she'd been trying to reconcile, and she'd found a folder on the corner of the desk that wasn't closed properly. She wouldn't have looked, except the name on the top document was the same as the name on the debt her father had owed. Reeve Estate, contested. She stood there for a long time before she put it back where she'd found it. That evening at supper she said, "I found the file, about the estate dispute. I wasn't snooping, I was looking for the Hendricks invoice, and it was on the desk." Callum was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right, what does it mean?" He set down his fork. "Boyd, my uncle, claims the ranch should have come to him when my father died. It didn't. He's been contesting it for 3 years, and the debt, my family's debt, Boyd holds it, not me." She stared at him. "Then why are you?" She stopped. "Why did you come to the house? Why did you talk to us?" He picked up his fork again. "Because he was going to pursue it, your family's land, the house, everything. I knew Boyd. I knew what he'd do if I wasn't involved." He looked at her steadily. "I thought this was better, she said. "For your family." "Yes." She thought about her mother in the cardiac unit. She thought about the $43,000. She thought about the house her father had built with his own hands, and what it would have looked like with a bank notice on the door. She didn't say thank you. She wasn't sure it was the right word. But something shifted that evening, somewhere between the table and the door. She didn't try to name it. She just noticed that the weight she'd been carrying since March felt, for the first time, like it might be something she didn't have to carry alone. The hearing was set for the 2nd week of September. Boyd Reeve had filed a motion claiming Callum's father, his older brother Graham, had been mentally incompetent in the last year of his life, and therefore the will was invalid. Boyd wanted the ranch. He wanted the water rights. He wanted the mineral leases that Callum had spent 8 years developing carefully and quietly. He'd also, Juniper discovered, been telling people in town that the marriage was fraudulent, that Callum had tricked a grieving woman into signing papers she didn't understand to bolster his case. A wife made the estate claim look more stable, more legitimate, harder to contest. She heard this from Rosamond, who'd heard it from her cousin, who lived in Fort Macleod, and had run into Boyd Reeve at a hardware store. She drove back to the ranch that afternoon with something cold and solid sitting in her chest. She found Callum in the equipment shed, doing something to the hydraulics on the header. She stood in the doorway until he noticed her. "Boyd is telling people you married me to protect the estate claim." Callum straightened. He didn't look away. "Yes. Is he right?" A long pause. Partly. I married you," he said, "because Boyd was going to take everything your family had. That was real. That I wanted to stop." He set down the wrench. "If it also made the estate case stronger, I won't pretend I didn't know that. So you used me. I protected your family. I also benefited. Both things are true." She stood there for a long moment. She could feel her heart doing something complicated in her chest. "Why didn't you tell me that from the start? Would you have come?" She thought about it honestly. Probably not. He nodded once. Like that confirmed something he'd already made peace with. She went back inside. She made supper. She put 2 plates on the table and sat down and waited. He came in at 6:15, washed his hands at the sink, and sat across from her. They ate in silence. When he reached for the salt, he passed her the bread without being asked, because she usually wanted it, and he had apparently noticed that. She watched him do it. She thought, "This is a man who notices things. He just doesn't talk about them." She thought, "That is either the best thing about him or the most dangerous." The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the south-facing room, with the window cracked, and listened to the horses in the corral and the distant sound of the highway and the way the wind moved through the grass differently here than it did anywhere she'd ever lived. She'd spent 3 months learning the sounds of this place. She'd learned the difference between the creak of the house settling and the sound of Callum's boots on the stairs. She'd learned which ranch hand drove too fast up the road, and which one idled for 5 minutes before shutting off the truck. She thought about Boyd Reeve, whom she'd met only once, briefly, at a gas station in Lethbridge. He'd been polite in a way that made her feel watched. He'd shaken her hand and said something about how she must be finding the ranch a big change from the city, which was not true. She'd grown up on a grain farm. She'd grown up with mud in early mornings and the particular exhaustion of harvest season, and she'd said something neutral in reply and watched his eyes the whole time. His eyes were calculating. They moved over things the way you move over a property you're considering buying. She got up at 5, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark. Callum came downstairs at 5:30. He stopped when he saw her. He didn't say anything about it, about the fact that she was up 2 hours early, sitting in the kitchen in the dark, which was, if she was honest, the kind of thing that warranted at least one question. He got a mug. He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd made. He sat down across from her. After a while, she said, "I'm going to testify." Callum looked at her. "Juniper, Boyd is going to say this marriage isn't real. I'm going to tell them it is." She wrapped her hands around her mug. "It is real. I signed those papers. I've been here. That's real." "It wasn't." He stopped, started again. "You didn't have many options when you signed." "No, but I had some. I chose this one." She looked at him. "Don't tell me not to go." He was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen was very still. Outside, the first birds were starting somewhere in the trees along the creek. "I wouldn't," he said finally, quietly, "tell you not to go." The hearing was held in Lethbridge, in a courtroom that smelled like old paper and central air. Callum's lawyer was a deliberate woman named Miss Fournier, who had prepared Juniper with 3 hours of questions the week before and told her to answer only what she was asked and not to fill silences. Boyd Reeve sat across the room with 2 lawyers and an expression of patient confidence that Juniper found deeply irritating. When she took the stand, Boyd's lawyer asked her how she'd come to be married to Callum Reeve. She told the truth, all of it. The debt, her father, her mother's surgery, the justice of the peace in the hospital waiting room. She did not soften it. She did not make it sound like something it wasn't. Boyd's lawyer smiled, like she'd just given him exactly what he needed. "So the marriage was a financial arrangement." "It started as one," Juniper said. "And now?" She thought about tea on the porch railing. She thought about bread passed without asking. She thought about "that's enough," said once and not repeated, and how the table had gone quiet. "Now," she said, "it's a marriage." Boyd's lawyer paused. Then, "Can you elaborate on that?" "My husband noticed, sometime in July, that I read in the evenings. He moved a lamp to the sitting room because the overhead light was too harsh." She looked at the judge, not at Boyd. "He doesn't talk much, but he notices things. That's not a financial arrangement. That's a person." The courtroom was quiet. Miss Fournier did not ask any follow-up questions. She didn't need to. The judge ruled in Callum's favor on a Friday afternoon. Miss Fournier called with the news. Juniper was in the kitchen making a grocery list when her phone rang, and she stood at the counter and said, "Thank you," and hung up, and then stood there for a minute doing nothing in particular. When Callum came in from the yard, she was still standing in roughly the same spot. He looked at her. "We won," she said. He stopped. Something moved through his expression. Relief, maybe, though it was quiet, the way everything about him was quiet. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, like his legs had decided to weigh more than usual. She sat down across from him. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then Callum said, "Your mother's lease, the house. Boyd won't be able to touch any of it now. The debt is cleared. That was part of the settlement conditions Miss Fournier put in." Juniper nodded. She knew. "You didn't have to testify," he said. "What you told them. You didn't have to say any of that." "I know." "Why did you?" She thought about it. She thought about standing in the doorway of the equipment shed and hearing him say, "Both things are true," with the kind of steadiness that meant he'd made his peace with being imperfect. She thought about the way he'd sat down across from her in the hospital waiting room all those months ago and simply waited without filling the silence with anything useless. "Because it was true," she said. "And because I'm not in the habit of letting people take things that aren't theirs." He looked at her for a moment. Then quietly, "Neither am I." Outside, the afternoon light was going long and gold across the pasture, the way it did in September when the season was starting to turn. Juniper looked out the window at the horses moving slowly in the last warmth of it. She thought about her mother, who would be strong enough to visit by October. She thought about the room at the end of the hall with the quilt and the window and the hook behind the door, and how somewhere between March and September it had stopped feeling like a room she was borrowing. She looked back at Callum. "I'll start supper," she said. He stood. "I'll set the table." It was the most ordinary thing in the world. It felt to Juniper Ashby like the beginning of something she hadn't known she was allowed to want.